This week we are going to dramatically increase the speed at which we view history, and we're going to move from 1500 to about 1900, covering a big picture of about 400 years of world history, so that we can focus more on the 20th century throughout the course. But we're going to do a big sweep, so get ready. There are various schools and styles of studying history which are important to note. I'm going to describe some of them. For example, there's a Marxist school which looks at class-based analysis, and this is important to understand that individuals who are within this school are not necessarily Marxist politicians, right? They're not necessarily communists. That's often an assumption, but that's not the case. There is a Marxist way of looking at history that does class-based analysis. There's also post-Marxist schools of history that work on class-based analysis, but add gender and so forth to the description. There's another school called classicalism, which looks specifically at so-called classical cultures, focusing mostly on like Greeks and Romans and this kind of stuff. The Annales school is a French school which is quite influential, in fact influenced some of my ways of studying history. I'm looking at the big picture of history, the big picture of social movements and this kind of thing. Looking at history from the ground up, looking at the longue durée of history, hundreds of years at a time. Within the United States, sometimes you get different schools of history associated with different universities. So, for example, the Wisconsin School of the middle of the 20th century through the latter part of the 20th century and arguably influencing professors up through the present. The California School, in a similar fashion, 1960s, 1970s, arguably influencing professors up through the present. You also have these different approaches like I described. Social history, looking at social movements. Environmental history, looking at environmental movements. You could have intellectual history, looking at intellectuals, political history, history of politics, diplomatic history of diplomacy, cultural history of culture, economic history of economics, and then the social social movements. In this class, you will find that I'm blending many of these different types: political, diplomatic, intellectual, cultural, economic, social, and we add on to that environmental in the approach. So it's a robust approach in this class. There are new ideas about thinking about history and world history moving into the 21st century. We examine the legacy of colonialism, the centrality of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We examine the nature of the environment, and that sometimes it worked against colonial powers, such as in Southeast Asia, or in the case of the Haitian Revolution, where colonialists coming from Europe were not immune to specific diseases. In the case of the Haitian Revolution, this seems to have particularly weakened the French troops who were living in Haiti. This is not to say that the generals working in the Haitian Revolution from the Creole class of generals or local Haitians themselves who were either indigenous or African descended were not adept revolutionaries. In fact, they were. But predominantly, we are talking about a human relationship with the environment and how it shapes history now. I want to ask a question. Just respond to the question and respond to one another. You don't have to make long points, just a short point to get the juices flowing. What does it mean to provincialize Europe? And what might be the advantages to this approach? Go ahead and make a quick post and let's get going.